Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, where we're asking that question, when did the Bible become the Bible? And I hope over these last few sessions, you've had the opportunity perhaps to think through and explore some of the processes that occurred prior to the bringing together of the Bible as we now understand it and know it, and of course love it and really value it. In this session, we're going to think about collectors. I guess we're all familiar with people's natural desire to collect all kinds of different things. Some people are very serious about their collections and even catalogue them. Perhaps some of the collections are very unique or worth a lot of money and so on. But by nature, we do like to get one or two things, even if we wouldn't consider ourselves to be collectors in the wider sense of that word. What we're going to do in this particular session is ask, when did people start to collect together those various books, the 66 books that we now have as the Bible? We're quite used to carrying a Bible around or having it on our phones or on a tablet or whatever. We're quite used to the order and structure of things. But of course, for that to come about, there would have been a period when many people were involved in collecting together this material and bringing it to where it is and how we understand it today. I need to say that I can't promise that this will be straightforward, because I think as we've realized, even with authorship, there is little that is straightforward, and the Bible is an amazingly complex thing, and the processes around the formation of the Bible as we now have it is a very complex thing. And so we're going to have a look at the processes today of the collectors, but by no means can we pin it down precisely. I need to say also, you'll be glad to know that hopefully this session is going to be a little bit shorter than the others, primarily because, of course, there are less certainties around it. It's a very obvious thing to say, but of course, books as we now know them didn't exist at the time when much of the biblical literature was being shaped and brought together. Of course, you will be well aware that people wrote on scrolls, and these massive scrolls, and many of them were very large. One scroll could contain probably the whole of Isaiah's prophecy, as we now have it in Scripture. So these were significant documents, significant scrolls, which of course were kept and treasured as being of great religious importance and significance. Originally, scrolls were written, or they were shaped on papyrus, and then, of course, when they were rolled up, that formed what we now call a scroll. By the time Christians began to collect material together, obviously post-Pentecost, it was at a time when the possibility of bringing material together in what we would call books today began to become more readily available. And it was easier, much easier for the church, the early church, to begin to pull that material together, which of course in the past had always been contained on very large scrolls, which no one really could carry around with them because of their sheer volume and their weight and their size. At the heart of Jewish scripture, at the heart of the Jewish faith, of course, is what's known as the Torah. The Torah are the books of the law. And by the 4th century BC, Judaism had brought the 5 books together, which became known as the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, of course, we now know as the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Added to this material that was beginning to be gathered together were what were known as the books of the prophets, but not the books that we now would call or group together as the prophets, but books like Judges, Joshua, Samuel. Interestingly, both Kings and Samuel, although we now have 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Kings, originally they were one book. It was later on that they were divided up into the 2 books that we're now so familiar with. So that's different to what we would refer to as prophetic scripture. So at that time, around about the 4th century BC, we have the gathering together of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books that we now view through the Old Testament. And then, of course, the bringing together of what was known as the prophets, which were some of those early books that we would now define as his history books. They come in that history section of the Old Testament for us. So instead of seeing what we would call a movement from book to book as we now have it in the Bible, there was a very distinctive distinction between the books of the law, the Torah, and the other books. It wasn't that they were seen as a set of 5 books that were followed on by these 5 books, as in a chronological sequence. It was actually seen as 2 separate areas. They weren't viewed in the way that we would now view them as we would open up our contents page in our Bible. But by the time Christianity began to emerge and grow and develop through the world, the ancient world as it was at that time, and particularly when the church became more Gentile in flavor, because of course, ultimately, although the church had its origins within the Jewish community, we recognize, of course, that the church soon expanded and the Gentile believers became the larger group. So the characteristic of the church and the way that it valued scriptures, understood scriptures, was beginning to change. Because, of course, within the Jewish Christian church at the time, around Pentecost and just beyond Pentecost, of course, all those believers would have been steeped in Jewish scripture. So they would have valued the Torah, the law, and so on. By the time the church expands and takes much more of a Gentile kind of profile, then, of course, at that time, those Gentiles were not rooted in Jewish scriptures. They didn't have any particular feeling that they were any more significant than anything else. And so at that time, you began to see that the church began to see itself less shaped by the law books, the Torah, and more shaped by the law of Christ. And so the church is beginning to move on in its understanding, how it defines itself in terms of scriptures. Not to say that the Jewish Torah was seen to be anything but significant, but probably less significant for the Gentile believers, the Gentile church, than, of course, the law that came through Christ. And we find that in the Sermon on the Mount and, of course, in other places through the gospel stories. Interestingly enough, Jewish scriptures had been translated into Greek around about, well, it was a long old period of translation, probably between 3 BC to 1 BC, the 3rd century, through to the 1st century BC. the Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek, what was known as the Septuagint. Septuagint, of course, meaning 70. There were 70 translators involved in working on that over a very, very long period. But ultimately, the Septuagint became available, of course, to the Greek-speaking world. And that was a translation of the original Jewish law and prophets. Throughout the New Testament, you'll find a little phrase emerging. People often referred, as they looked back, for some sense of the importance of what was happening. They would often refer to the law and the prophets. And at the time of Christ, you find that being used. And of course, later on, the early church often referred to the law and the prophets. And I guess that distinction between the first 5 books and the prophets, and now we're beginning to talk about the prophets as we would understand them and know them, that distinctive gap between the two was beginning to close. And there was much more of a sense of the wholeness of Jewish scriptures, which were being referenced by the early church at that time through that statement, the law and the prophets say this, don't they say this, and so on. And so that distinction was beginning to close, and we're now seeing the emergence of the prophetic literature as we probably would now understand it. So at that time, it was beginning to be shaped up into what they called the former prophets and the latter prophets, what we now refer to as the major and minor prophets. And so that what we're seeing here is a process taking place of how the Bible that we now have is beginning to shape. It's beginning to come into some format that we might well recognize. In Jewish scripture, you'll find references to Jewish scripture, of course. So, for example, let's take Luke 24 and verse 44, if you want to look that up. You can see that it talks about the law and the prophets, and it also adds into that the Psalms. That's, again, a recognition that a process is taking place, because now not only do we have the laws and the prophets, the Psalms wouldn't have been considered at that time to be the equivalent or as significant as the other 2 main sections. But again, you can see the way that a process is taking place and scripture is beginning to merge. Christians very early on began to bring a sense of God's revelation through scripture together. They held the law and the prophets and the Psalms, and there was a definite movement within the Christian church, a bringing together. They viewed them all simply as scripture in that sense. And it was only over time, the first, second century of AD, the first and second century AD, that what we know as the first written format of what we might well call scripture, the Greek Bible, it began to group these books into their various sections, sections that we're now familiar with: history, prophetic, prophecies, poetry, and again, you begin to see the shape, the distinctive shape of the Bible beginning to emerge. When it comes to the Gospels, we have 4 Gospels, of course, in the New Testament. Because we have them readily available, we can see all 4 Gospels. We can read all 4 together if we would choose to do so. We need to recognize, of course, that wasn't the case in the early church. The Gospels were written, obviously, by different individuals, but they were also written in different locations, and they were also written at different times. So Mark probably wrote his gospel in Rome, Matthew in Syria, Luke was in Asia Minor, and John, well, we know, was in Ephesus. And so when we talk about the grouping together of four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we're so familiar, the early church wasn't familiar with that. Each of those Gospels was available in a different part of the world. And of course, at that time, the movement between places was difficult and challenging. And so you had a situation emerging where you would have had, say, Mark's gospel probably written in Rome. Well, the Roman Christians would have had that, but then they, of course, wouldn't have had the other gospels. And almost you have this emergence of individual areas almost having their own individual gospels. And it wasn't until much later that, of course, those four gospels were brought together in one. It may be the case that if you lived in Rome, you weren't even aware that there was such a thing as other gospels. You just had your one gospel. It wasn't until Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon, he began to talk about the four Gospels. That was around about AD 180. That's probably the first written evidence that we have of a wider understanding and appreciation in the church that there were in fact four Gospels and not just simply one in that sense. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't collected together earlier than that. It's the only written reference, or the earliest written reference we have that. But certainly by some point by the 2nd century AD, those four Gospels were being gathered together and collated together. When it comes to Paul's letters, which of course is the bulk of the letter material that we find in the New Testament, of course, what you have there is a series of letters written to distinctive groups of Christians. Distinctive letters written to distinctive groups of churches to deal with distinctive issues and problems, sometimes encouragements, sometimes challenging. And of course, each of those letters would have been valued by the group that it was written to. For example, if it's Ephesians, then that book or that letter would have been available to Christians in Ephesus. But of course, it wasn't available to other Christians in other places. And so you have a whole series of letters being written out to individual gatherings of churches in all sorts of different locations. And again, we're uncertain when actually those letters began to be gathered together into what we now, of course, know as the Pauline letters. Paul certainly encouraged his readers to spread the material that was written down by the scribe that he would have dictated to. He certainly encouraged the churches to spread that around as much as they could. But we're living in a very different world at that time. And it wasn't until later when those letters would have been brought together. We're not even exactly sure when that happened. And we're even less sure about who would have been involved in that whole process. So when you ask that question, well, who were these collectors? Who gathered the material together? Well, I guess in terms of Jewish scriptures, what we now call the Old Testament, then of course that would have been scholars, religious leaders within Judaism, those that maintained and had oversight over the religious practices of the Jewish people. They would have brought those together. Who exactly they were and when exactly that was happening, is a lot less clear. But at least we can say that that's the arena in which that would have happened. When it comes to the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, of course, that is a lot less certain. We don't have particular records that we can refer to. But we can say during the 1st to the 2nd century AD, that material was beginning to be gathered together. Who exactly did that? Probably church leaders. Early on, the apostles bringing together the core apostolic teachings. The local church groups working together and collating this material, codifying the material, and bringing it together. And of course, later on, we have the emergence of what's known as the Church Fathers, like Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon. And they certainly played a role in bringing together what we now refer to as the New Testament. A complex process with a lot less certainties than perhaps we would imagine. But I hope it's given us a chance to see something of the complexity of how Scripture ended up in the format that we now have today. And again, I want to emphasize that none of that, for me personally, undermines my belief that Scripture is inspired by God and that God's hand has been on that process. But we need to acknowledge that the process has been complicated and not straightforward.
Your word, O Lord, is my delight. It plants me like a tree that's rooted by the streams of life. So Lord, set your word in me. Your word, O Lord, it lights my way, and by this light I see. It guides me in every step I take. So Lord, set your word in me. Speak, O Lord, speak, O Lord, we are ready to receive. Speak, O Lord, through your mighty word, oh, set your word in me. Your word, O Lord, is my delight. It plants me like a tree that's rooted by the streams of life. So Lord, set your word in me. So Lord, set your word